Sure. Thanks, Samek. So hey everyone. So my talk is going to be, well, before we get started, sorry, let's just give a thanks to the opportunity for Purview and Defender Days. So for those unaware, it's a one-day virtual event. There's two tracks across Purview and Defender, and there's also going to be some giveaways at the end. You can see the prizes on the right-hand side. So my session today is going to be on Purview, eDiscovery, and Purview Audit better together, how they can work together to really help for incident response. And I'm a Microsoft 365 incident responder in financial services. So a bit about me, I recently became a Microsoft Security MVP. As I mentioned, I'm a M365 or Azure incident responder in financial services. I have 4 Microsoft certifications, which is the AZ500, SC400, SC200, and MS500. And I have over 5 years experience across the whole sort of Microsoft security stack, which includes like Purview compliance, Defender, Azure, and Sentinel. I actively contribute to the community, and the way I contribute is through speaking at talks like this. I was also a technical reviewer of that SC100 book you can see on the right-hand side, and I'm also an author for the eDiscovery book you can see on the right-hand side as well. I'm most active on LinkedIn, so that's my LinkedIn URL there, so feel free to connect with me. And I also have a GitHub, which acts as my portfolio, and I have a few projects there as well. Okay, so what are we going to be covering today? So I'm going to give a kind of a high level on what eDiscovery is for people unaware. Also what audit is. So they're both solutions within the Purview compliance sort of stack. We're then going to walk through a eDiscovery incident response scenario. I just realized the camera's not on as well. Let me turn that on. Hopefully that's visible. And then we're going to audit that eDiscovery scenario as well. And then we'll walk through the second incident response scenario, and then we'll audit that. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a summary. Okay, so a bit about eDiscovery. So firstly, what is it? So eDiscovery is a way to retrieve content from M365, right? So that could be like your Exchange Online emails, any files on SharePoint or OneDrive, even your Teams conversations, and it also extends to services like Power BI, Loop, etc. With licensing, so those familiar will know about E3 and E5 licensing. So at the minimum, you need an E3 to do sort of basic eDiscovery, which is like content search or eDiscovery standard. But when you want to do eDiscovery Premium, which is what I'm going to be walking through, you need a E5 compliance add-on or the full E5 license. In terms of roles required, basically you can do eDiscovery Manager, which will then let you see the cases and create cases. But there's also a eDiscovery Admin, which will let you see all the cases across the tenant. And there's sort of Purview compliance role groups that you can be added to with those permissions as well, to basically get access to Purview eDiscovery that way. And then KQL, right? So those that joined maybe the Defender track previously a while ago was Samek's talk on KQL. So that was Custo query language. So with eDiscovery, you have something called KQL, but it's keyword query language. And in brief, it's a way to basically specify what content you want to pull back through eDiscovery, because eDiscovery is a very powerful tool. And if you're not really specific in what you're pulling back, you could end up revealing more information than you should see. So at sort of a high level, that's kind of what eDiscovery is. And I did cover KQL or keyword query language more in this talk. So, after this session or after you watch this, you can go and check that out and learn a bit more as well. Okay, so now we move on to Purview Audit. So again, what is Purview Audit? So Purview Audit is a way to basically look for all the activities that occur in your M365 tenant, right? So that could be like people uploading a file to SharePoint, sending an email, adding someone to a particular role group. All those kind of activities are logged in what we call the unified audit log. And Purview Audit is one mechanism to consume that audit log. In terms of licensing, again, E3, E5, makes a return. So with E3, you get access to Audit Standard, which will give you 90 days worth of retention of logs, and also, the activities that are within that licensing SKU. And then Audit Premium, which again, I'm going to focus on later on in the talk. You need an E5 license or an E5 compliance add-on, which will give you up to a year, well, by default, sorry, a year's retention of logs, but you can also configure up to 10 years with audit log retention policy. And roles required, right? So again, audit logs could be a place of, a lot of information. So you want to make sure that you're giving kind of the least privilege roles, right? So there is a view-only audit logs permission in Exchange Online. So that's an Exchange Admin Center role group. So you can be added to that, and then you can consume the Purview Audit. Equivalently, there are roles now within Purview and Defender portals, which is Audit Reader and Audit Manager. And again, least privilege role would be Audit Reader there. And then methods to explore it, right? So I mentioned one, which is the Purview Audit. So that's one way to consume the audit log, but you can also have this go into a SIM. So through the O365 Management API, you could send this to your SIM. Through data connectors, you could get it directly into Sentinel. And you can also consume it through PowerShell using the Search Unified Audit Log PowerShell commandlet. And again, I've done a kind of a deep dive on this, or more like an intro for people unfamiliar with some specific use cases last year. So again, you can check this out after this talk to learn a bit more. Okay, so now we're actually going to move on to our first incident response scenario. Okay, so the way I've structured this is almost like for those of you that have done Microsoft certifications, you'll know about the case studies that they have. They'll give you some background, they'll give you technical details, and give you a task. So that's kind of the way I've structured this here. And the background is that a user has sent an email externally with a sensitive attachment. Now, in the previous talk, Kate was covering DLP and information sort of leaving the organization. That's definitely a valid use case for an incident response scenario, because it could be an insider threat trying to, gain a competitive edge if they're moving companies. Or it could just be a method of, getting that data out, which could be proprietary to your organization. So it's a very, specific scenario we want to focus on, which aligns to that DLP piece that Kate was talking about as well. Technical details. So you're told that the email was sent by a user called Adele Vance. The email was sent on the 16th of July, 2024. The recipient of the email, there was an actual Gmail address here, but I've redacted that. So let's just go with it. So we'll say redacted@gmail.com. And the subject of the email was speaking codes, no binary, right? And what you can see is all the parts in sort of square brackets here. Let me do the sort of boxes here, right? So you can see the square brackets here. All of those will basically form our conditions later on in keyword query language. And I'll come back to that when I get to that point. And lastly, Adele is on Exchange Online, right? So these are the kind of technical details you have. You have who sent the email, the date on which it was sent, the recipient, the subject, and the fact that they're on Exchange Online. And your task is basically to use Purview eDiscovery Premium, which, as we remember, needs the E5 license or E5 compliance add-on, to retrieve the email and understand the contents of the attachment. Because again, remember on the background, we said that it was a sensitive attachment, right? So knowing that in mind, right? So what you can firstly do is you need to create an eDiscovery case. So obviously I've kind of assumed some prerequisites here, like, you've already got to the eDiscovery portal, which is at compliance.microsoft.com, soon to be purview.microsoft.com. You found the eDiscovery solution, you've gone to cases and gone to new case, right? So I'm kind of assuming that you're at that stage when walking through this. So once you get to that stage, right, and you create your case, the first thing it asks you is for a name. And again, you can see this red star here, which means that that's a mandatory field. So in this case, we've chosen number 69, push-ups at 616, right? Description, again, you can put the same case name. You could put maybe any details about the case that you want to put. And you can also put a number. So the number could be like a ticketing number. Maybe you've got some ITSM kind of tool and you've got incident references there. You can put those numbers in there to help you with your case sort of management piece. Then it asks you to add team members and configure settings, right? So the team members could be like anyone else that you're working on the case with. So, typically maybe you're working kind of a follow the sun model. So within your sort of shift of, your time zone period, etc., you can do so much, but then you'll hand off to maybe another regional team. So you could maybe add a representative for that team so that they can see this case and you can say, hey, I've got to this part of the case. I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And then they can sort of continue it. They also need to have the right eDiscovery permissions, otherwise this won't work, right? So everyone that does eDiscovery does need those permissions. So that's the users and groups. And then you also have these search and analytics and kind of advanced features like ignore text, so you can ignore certain characters, etc. But for our purposes, we're going to keep things simple and just go with the defaults of, no additional members, no additional groups, no additional kind of modification to the settings. So we hit next on this, and this basically gives you a summary of your case so far. So you can see the name, you can see the description, the number. You can see that the format is advanced new. So eDiscovery Advanced is because we're using the premium. If it was standard or content search, this case format would be reflected differently. In fact, for content search, you wouldn't have a case, but for eDiscovery Standard, you would. But the key thing to remember is that the name, because as we'll see later, that is one field that's audited. So, you want to make sure that that matches any sort of naming convention if your company has one. And again, you can see a preview of kind of the members if we added any to the case. So we can hit submit on that, which will then basically let us know that the case is ready, and we can move on to the next step of the workflow. So the next step of the workflow is adding your data sources, right? So the way data sources works is you need to find a person or a location in which you want to pull the data from. So in our case, we know that Adele Vance sent the email, right, which was suspicious. Um, so we'd want to add Adele. And because Adele is like a user, we kind of call them custodians. So we would go with the add new custodian option, which you can see here, right? So once we click on add new custodian, that will then basically let you select the custodian here. So you can start typing Adele's name. It's going to suggest her. Again, I've redacted the email address, but that would show. Once you click on that, it will basically start pulling in her details. At least not necessarily like the actual content of the details, but just like what sort of data sources she has access to, right? So, for example, she has a mailbox. She'll have a OneDrive. Below this, there's also Teams, which would be like Teams channel she's part of, et cetera, et cetera. But what you notice is by default is selected mailboxes and OneDrive. Well, in our scenario, we're only trying to pull an email, so we don't really need the OneDrive. So we can basically hit clear on this, as you can see here. And then now this changes to 0 out of 1 for OneDrive, but 1 out of 1 for mailboxes. So it's important to know that, when you add the custodians, choose the locations that are representative to what you're trying to find, so you don't accidentally pull in extra locations that you're not really supposed to. So just something to be mindful there. And then holds, right? So by default, it applies a hold on Adele's profile and mailbox as well. Now, depending on your sort of regulatory requirements, you may want to have this. Maybe you're also handling this with a sort of a retention management policy. So you can kind of untick and tick as you see fit. For our purposes, we're not going to deal with holds, so I'm going to untick it so you can see that that's been cleared out now. And then you can proceed to the review screen. So again, the review screen is an opportunity before you hit submit to just make sure you've configured everything correctly. For example, here, if I saw like Teams had a count of 1, then I would know that I've maybe pulled in more data than I'm supposed to. So I'd be able to adjust that by hitting the back button, fixing it, and then hitting submit. But in our case, we have mailbox account of 1 and the hold value being false, which is what we expected, so that's fine. Okay, so then it will start creating your custodian. And it says that they're available for use in the collections, right? So collections is the next phase, but we'll come to that in a minute. When you add that data source, it's going to start indexing them, right? So you can see here that this status says indexing. You don't need to really wait for this indexing to complete. You can sort of begin the collection phase, but sometimes if you don't get any results in the collection, it could be because the indexing hasn't finished. So it's worth kind of keeping an eye on that. You can refresh till the indexing says fully indexed, like it says here, right? So once it's fully indexed, and we're confident that this is happy to sort of move on to the next stage of the workflow, we can begin, right? So now we're on the collection phase. So with the collection phase, you can basically see that you want to create new collection. When you do that, again, it gives you an opportunity to type in a name and a description. So again, your name could be, I've put collection number 1 here, but it could be any sort of name that's representative for your case. Maybe, again, you want to put the ticket number that we referenced earlier. And in the description, maybe you could put an idea of like what you're trying to retrieve, like if it's emails or Teams conversations or, SharePoint files, etc. But for now, we'll leave this name and description as it is, and we'll hit next. Now you get the opportunity to choose custodial data sources. And if you remember, we defined Adele Vance as a data source in the previous stage of the workflow. So now when you hit select custodians, it's going to bring up those previously added custodians. So you can see Adele Vance here and her email, which again has been redacted. So basically we can tick this and we can hit add. which will then add Adele as a custodial data source. And one thing that you notice is OneDrive and additional mailboxes say none, and that's because we were very specific when we selected Adele previously to make sure that only mailbox was selected. If we didn't, then this is an opportunity to also untick it here, but it's best to not even get to this stage with any extra information. So the fact that we already reduced it to just the mailbox reflects perfectly here. Then you get an option to do non-custodial data sources. Now, we won't deal with that for this scenario, but the second scenario that I'll come on to a bit later, we'll deal with that. So we'll skip that for now and move on to the next part, which is additional locations. Again, additional locations could be other mailboxes that you want to pull in, any sort of SharePoint sites and public folders. Again, for our use case, we don't need that, so we'll leave all those off. And now we move on to the search query part, right? So this is the keyword query language that I was talking about. Again, you can see KQL here, but it's important to remember that KQL is keyword query language, not custo query language. And you have two options, right? So similar to what Samik showed, you have kind of a query builder, which will walk you through it in a bit more of an easy kind of interface to navigate through. But you also have the KQL editor. So let's step through the query builder, and then we'll switch to the KQL editor when time permits. So firstly, you can add some conditions, right? So we knew, for example, the email was sent on I think it was the 16th of July. So there's a date condition. So when you click date, it will let you specify kind of contextual parameters about that condition. So you could say like the date is before a certain date or after a certain date or between a certain date. So in my case, we're going to go with between, and we're going to choose between 16th of July and 17th of July. The way this works is basically like if the email is sent on 16th of July, you can't kind of do start date 16th and end date 16th. You have to kind of choose one day out. And the way to interpret this is basically it starts at 16th July 00 a.m. UTC and ends at 17th July 23:59 p.m. UTC. So that encompasses the whole date range. You can't specify times at this current state, so you kind of have to do it at the date level, even if you know the specific time that it was sent. Right, so that's important to remember. Just make sure that if it's sent on this particular date, add one extra date to the start or the end date to, make sure that that's captured correctly. And then we basically can add the other conditions that we saw, right? So for example, we knew that the sender was Adele. We knew that the recipient was this Gmail address. And if you remember, we also had the subject property. Now, the subject property, as it says, it enter comma separated values. Well, keen eyes in the audience that remember would remember that the subject was speaking codes no binary, and there was a comma in between it, right? So you can see here. So if you were to speculate, what do you think is going to happen? Well, if you thought that it's going to do two separate subjects, you were right. Because of the comma, it's already put it into, subject is this or subject is this. And again, this is within the KQL editor. So one thing to step back, right? If you kind of proceed with this as it is because it looks fine to you, you actually would get different results to what you're expecting because it's going to see this comma and intelligently kind of split subject 1 as speaking codes and subject 2 as no binary, as you can see in KQL editor. So I say that to say that you should kind of be, as you're getting started, it's fine to use the query editor, but it's worth stepping into the KQL editor to really understand how that's being represented on the back end, and more importantly, when you need to sort of override it, because certain fields, as we'll see in the second use case later, are not present in the query editor, but they are present through the KQL editor. So anyway, so the way we fix this is we just basically combine both the subjects within the, we just combine this within the, one sec, within the subject property, right? So you can see here that now it says subject equals speaking codes, comma, no binary, and both of them are within quotes. So what that's going to do is that's basically going to say, get me the email that has this date property from this sender, and the recipient is this, and the subject is, speaking codes no binary as one sort of single subject, right? Which is what we wanted. So then you can basically review the collection. Again, it's an opportunity to make sure that all the details are correct before you submit it, because again, as we'll see later, some of these properties are audited and you don't want to get caught out. So again, you can see the name, you can see the description, you can see the keyword query language conditions within the search criteria here, which basically matches what we expected. And you can also see the custodial data sources, which we've chosen as Adele. Okay, so then we create the collection, and as it says, your collection will be added to your review set as a draft collection, right? So what we can then do is it's going to start estimating. So this one already says status estimated, but typically when you kick this off first time, it will say like progressing. In my estimation, it takes about a minute or two, and then it starts kind of being complete in a viewable state. So once it's estimated, you basically know that it's in a viewable state. And if you look here, you can see that one item had a hit. And if you click on view samples, you get an idea of how that email is represented, right? So you can see on the left-hand side, and again, this is only one item, right? But this could be up to 10 or 20. But it's important to remember it's a sample. So if, for example, you have 2,000 items in your hits, you're not going to get all 2,000 in this view. For that, you'll need to commit it to a review set, which we'll come on to in a minute. But for now, just go with it to say we're only trying to pull one email and we've retrieved, so far at least one item. So at least it's matching and it shows that our conditions are as granular as possible, which is really important from sort of a regulatory perspective. But you can see on the right-hand side a sort of a preview of the email, right? So you can see it's from Adele. You can see the time it was sent. You can see the to email address. You can see the subject, but you can also see this attachment. And if you remember, the background said that it was a sensitive attachment, right? So this says isdp.docx, right? What is that? No one knows currently, but we'll find out what that is. And you can see the body of the email, which says find the secret code inside the attachment, right? So that suggests that maybe there's some sort of password or code word or something within the document. So in this view, you can't actually preview the attachment, right? So that's important to remember, and we'll do that in the next part of the workflow. But for now, you basically can, oh yeah, this is the next part of the workflow. So let me step back here. So far what we've seen is we've seen the body of the email and sort of some metadata about the email. But if we actually want to find what this attachment is, we need to commit this collection to a review set. And the way we do that, you can see here, just stepping back, is this commit collection button. When you hit that commit collection button, it's going to bring up this kind of dialog box. And basically what this allows you to do is to commit that collection to a review set. A review set, like, it's kind of implied from the name, but it's a place where you can then review the items that you've collected. But also it will do some intelligent kind of aggregation. So one, as we'll see in a minute, is it will get that attachment in a viewable format. But also what it can do, as you can see sort of here, is it can collect additional conversation. So I know my use cases aren't around Teams today. Maybe I'll cover that in a future talk. But if you retrieve sort of a Teams chat message of interest, it can actually go and get additional context about that Teams message. So it could get, up to 12 hours, as it says, back and forth in that message, which could be really helpful because if, let's say, a password or something is shared over Teams, you could maybe get some background context as to why that was even shared, right? Are people, colluding as insider threats to plan to do something at a particular time? All those kind of things could potentially be revealed through that conversation collection. And you can also collect what are called cloud attachments. So cloud attachments, again, is another sort of Teams use case, which I'm not covering here, but just mentioning, is if someone shares a link to a document in SharePoint or OneDrive, if you tick this option, you can actually collect those files from the SharePoint or OneDrive files on which they're located. So it's worth remembering that. So by default, those two options are ticked, and we'll leave them as they are. But one thing I want to mention is you can give the review set a name, which in my case is just review set number 1. But again, you could have some sort of ticket number here. You could add any sort of references that you want to. And then there's these other two options around versioning as well as partially indexed items, but we're not going to cover those today. And then finally, you can choose whether you want to add the whole collection to the review set or only the sample. So if you remember, right, what I said earlier, like if you had 2,000 hits, the sample may only be like, I don't know, 50, let's say. So if you do add all of collection, then you'd get all 2,000. Whereas if you did only sample, you'd only get like the 50 that I mentioned, right? So hopefully that's clear. But once you've configured this, you can hit commit and move on to the next part, which is basically it's going to start adding that collection to a review set. This does take some time, so this is a good opportunity to mention the Jobs tab. So you can kind of get an idea of the whole eDiscovery lifecycle here. And the key thing to pay attention to for this particular image is the Jobs tab. So the Jobs tab will basically show you all the kind of jobs or processes that are taking place within the eDiscovery case. So you can see, for example, there was already one around, around indexing the data sources. Let me do that again. Yeah, so around indexing the data sources as well as sort of doing the collection that we saw, and now it's adding the items to a review set. So all of these are possible within the jobs tab, but you can see that some say successful and some say in progress. So you need to kind of, keep refreshing and wait for it to go successful, and then you can sort of move on to the next part of the workflow. Um, so after some time, this review set will be done. In my case, it only took a minute. It can take longer depending on how many items you have. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But once it says successful, you can basically then go to the review set tab, which, if you remember, was here next to communications and collections in between those two. And then you can see that it says review set number 1, which is the one we created, right? So if you click on that, you can then basically see some metadata about the review set. So you can see the name. If I gave it a description, that would be there. You can see when it was created on. You can see who it was created by. And you can see it was last modified on the 2nd of August, in this case at 7:26 UTC +1. There's also some other tabs about load sets. So load sets are basically the collections that form that review set. Exports, we'll see later how to export it out of the review set. And again, you have sort of contextual jobs and errors within the review set as well. But for now, we'll open the review set. So when we open the review set, you can see two items, right? So firstly, you can see the email, you can tell from the icon here, but you can also see the Word document. So let's just make sure if the email looks any different to what we saw earlier. So if we select the first one, you can see a preview of it on the right-hand side. And yep, as expected, it's exactly the same as what we saw in the sample. But if we now choose the second one, you can see that we're starting to get details of what is in that Word document, right? So this is a lot of lorem ipsum stuff. But what if we scroll down? Oh, sorry, before we scroll down, let me just mention that this view can be a bit restricted. So what you can do is you can basically take this full screen by using this icon here. And then what that will do is that will bring this Word document into sort of a full screen view, which you'll see here. And then basically now you can consume the document a bit easier depending on your screen size, etc. So again, you can see some lorem ipsum, generic kind of text, but you can see this gray sort of image, right? So what is this gray image? Well, let's move on to the next slide.
They not like us. They not like us.
Yeah, so let's see. So that basically says Kendrick whispers, "I see dead people." And if you remember, right, the document says ISDP. So it could be that ISDP is I see dead people, and that could maybe be the secret code that Purav was referring to when he emailed Johnny in the email earlier. Because if you remember, it says find the secret code inside the attachment, right? So that could be the secret code.
They not like us. They not like us.
Yeah, so that's the idea basically, to preview the document, and hopefully that makes sense. So at this stage now, right, we not only understand the email, but we also understand the attachment, and we've retrieved the secret code. So now it's important to basically export this as our evidence, right? Because that's an artifact that we can have as part of our sort of incident response workflow to mention in our sort of final incident report, etc. So the way you do that is you need to export from the review set itself. So what you can do is you can select individual items. So let's say I only wanted the Word document. I could just tick that, hit actions, and then hit export. But if you think about it, the Word document is actually within the email. So why wouldn't I just export the email and then the attachment's already inside the email, right? So I can select number 1, I can hit actions and export as it says there, which will then bring up this kind of export options dialog box. So here you can basically give the export name. So again, we've chosen export for review set number 1. And the description can also be export for review set number 1. And then basically the options here are to export these documents. So you can choose like selected documents only. So as we saw, the ones that I ticked, you can also do filtered documents. So based on your tagging or any sort of filters that you apply in the review set, you can export those, or you can export everything in the review set, right? And then there's also an expand selection and output options, which we'll come on to now. So output options basically allows you to say, do you just want a report of the export? Do you want the loose files and the PSTs? Do you want to do a condensed directory structure? Do you want to even export it to your Azure storage account, which would export it to blob storage, right? And that's probably the most secure way of doing it. But for that, you do need to specify a container URL, and obviously you need a SAS token to actually authenticate to that storage account. So for our purpose, we're just going to go with condensed directory structure, and that's basically going to allow you to download it locally to your machine, and then you can move it to whatever forensic kind of evidence bucket, etc., that you guys may have for sort of secure long-term storage. And you can also see some options here about including. So you can include tags, text files. If you redact anything, so for example, let's say that I see dead people, what we saw was a sensitive business context kind of word, you can actually redact that and convert it to a PDF and then export it as a PDF. But for our purpose, we're just going to leave everything as default and just export. So when you export it, it's going to create a job, right? So you guys may remember earlier we saw the jobs tab, which has all the jobs in eDiscovery. So the job looks like this, which says prepare for export. Again, it will take however long it takes. In my case, it took a minute. And then you can see it says successful as well as the review set that it was exported from. And you can also then go to exports. And again, you can see the name of the export that we gave, which was export for review set number 1. And you can see that it says successful. When you click on this, this will give you an idea of what is actually in the export, what's called package. So there's a summary.csv, and there's also this kind of zip file. So you basically can select, both and then hit download. And this is basically what the summary.csv will tell you, right? So these are only some of the fields because it's quite a long CSV, but it basically gives you metadata about the export. So you can see the name, you can see the ID that's given, you can see the case name, you can see the case ID, you can see who started the export, when it was started, and then sort of some metadata about the export in terms of size, etc. And then when you open the second attachment, so if you remember, there were 2 files. So if you open the second one, which is the second zip, that will basically have these 3 files. So one is a native files, which is a folder, and then you also have export load file and warning errors 1 of 1. So let's go through native files. So within native files, you have this .msg, and for those familiar will know that .msg is basically emails, right? So as it says here, Outlook items. But what is this 3B65 ending in 732, right? How do I know, especially if I had multiple emails, like how do I know which email this corresponds to? Well, the export load file CSV that we mentioned actually will kind of help you to correlate that. So if you look, you can see the file ID of that 3B65, but you can see that the compound path has the subject of the email, which was that speaking codes no binary. So if you had multiple emails with different subjects, you could kind of find it, do an XLOOKUP of sorts and basically resolve those file IDs to the subject of the email. There's also this email subject property that you can see here as well, which just has the subject. So basically, the main takeaway there is don't be intimidated by the sort of the GUIDs that these are exported as, because you can always go to the export load file CSV and basically correlate those to the meaningful subjects. Okay, and then finally, when you open the actual MSG item in Outlook, this is how it's presented. Again, I've redacted the email, but this would basically let you see the email as if it was in your inbox kind of thing. And then you can open the attachment as we saw, and basically that's the end of your investigation. So now let's audit everything we did, right? So there's basically 6 operations that are created when you audit. So there's the case added, custodian created, query created, create working set, export job, and export viewed. And all these are operations within the eDiscovery, what we call record type. And again, some of them, you may be able to work out what they mean through the names, but let's step through them. So firstly, case added. And the way I've structured this is to basically pick out the key fields that I think are relevant for particular operations, right? There is a lot more details in the audit logs, but sort of respectfully speaking, they don't add any extra content operation. So the ones that I'm showing kind of on this and on future audit pages in this talk are the ones that I believe add the most value to this particular operation in terms of understanding it. But before we get into those, right, so one thing to mention is that all of these operations have the first 3 kind of properties, right? So they'll have, they'll have this one as well. So they'll have the ones that are in a red box right now, right? So they'll have the creation time, the operation, the user ID, and the case ID. Not all of them have the case property, which is the name, and a lot of them will have contextual information about the individual operations. So when you kind of see these, just bear in mind that creation time is always the operation collection's always there, user ID is always there, and case ID is always there. So you'll always know when it was done, who it was done by, what activity was done, and which case it relates to. But in this case, pardon the pun, you can see that the case was created at 6:16, right, which aligns to the case name of push-ups at 6:16. So that was well timed there. You can see the user ID was Purav in this case, right? Again, I've redacted the full email address. And you can see this case ID, which is 3344, 3038, GUID, etc. Then you have the custodian created, right? So with custodian created, you can basically see the details of who the custodian was that was added. So in this case, again, you can see when it was done, who it was done by, you can see the case ID, but you can see the name of the custodian, which is Adele Vance. You can see the contact email, which again has been redacted, but this would be their email address. And you can see this custodian ID, which is C1822, right? So just remember that at the back of your mind if you can. Then you move on to query created. So query created, if you remember, was the collection part, right? So again, you can see that we've got the name of the collection, which is collection number 1. You can see the query text, which is basically the keyword query language of that query. And you can see the person IDs. Now, the reason why I said to remember that C1822 is because that shows up here to prove that that query was conducted against Adele Vance. And why that's important is because you may have a case with multiple custodians. What if, in addition to Adele, you're investigating Megan or Nesta or any of these kind of users, you'd also individually have to add them as data sources. They'd also have their own custodian IDs, and then you'd have to perform queries against those. So the audit event for query created will show you specifically who that query was executed against, which is really helpful. Then you have create working set. So this is actually the review set operation, but they call it, sorry, they call it a working set for some reason in the eDiscovery audit. And again, here you can see the only sort of extra property of value is the extended properties.value, which is basically the working set ID. So again, if you can remember at the back of your mind, A6537, because that will appear shortly again, but all the first 4 columns are basically the same as what we've seen so far. Obviously, the time would be different as this was done later into the workflow, but it's the same case, same user ID, and this operation. Then you have the export job, right? So if you remember, we exported from the review set. So again, here you can see that A653 from the previous one, right, reappears here as extended properties.name because this is the working set ID. So what this is showing you is that you've exported it from that particular review set. And why this is important is because you may have multiple review sets within the same eDiscovery case. So you'd want to know which review set has actually been exported. So this will tell you that. And then you also have extended properties.value, which currently shows export option selected because the option that I chose in the export sort of dialog box was selected items. If I chose all items in a review set or filtered, etc., then this value would change. But because I manually sort of ticked them and selected them, it's basically chosen export option selected. So hopefully that makes sense. And then you have export viewed. So export viewed is basically just saying that, this export was generated and then it's been viewed. And if it's viewed, then most likely you can assume that it's been downloaded. Again, the only useful property here is the extended properties.value, which is A653, which is once again the working set ID. So what this shows you is the review set of A6537 was basically exported, and then the export was viewed and most likely downloaded, right? So that is basically the full life cycle of auditing IR scenario 1. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the sort of that walkthrough of how you sort of go through that process in the eDiscovery portal, but more importantly, how you govern and audit that, right? Because as we mentioned at the start, eDiscovery is a very kind of dangerous and permissive tool. So in the wrong hands, people could do some malicious things with it. So it's important to make sure, in the eyes of who watches the watchers, to make sure that your eDiscovery investigators are adhering to the standards and practices that you set. And you can closely do that through this auditing, which you can then set up alerts for your SIM and things like that. So just to be conscious of time, I have another scenario to walk through. This one I will be a bit faster because the first one, obviously, I went through kind of detailed step by step. Here, I'll be more covering sort of Delta scenario changes for this particular scenario. Okay, so similar to the other one, we have the background technical details and task. So basically the background for this one is that a user uploaded a file of interest on a previously investigated SharePoint site used for suspicious activity. So, this could have been because of an alert, let's say that notified the SOC or, any security professionals about, hey, we've seen this SharePoint before, this was used for this suspicious activity, and now there's been a new file added to it, please investigate. That could be sort of the trigger for this IR scenario. The technical details around this could be that the file of interest is an Excel workbook with extension of .xlsx. The file is called Big3. It was uploaded by Adele Vance, the same person that we investigated for scenario 1. The file is hosted on the Euphoria SharePoint site, and the path is Euphoria shared documents hip hop 2024 break the internet, right? And again, similar to before, I've put all the key details that we'll need for the KQL conditions in square brackets that you can see. So XLSX, Big3, Euphoria path, and the Euphoria SharePoint site. And those will become clear as we approach the query building part of this. But before that, let's go through the task, right? So the task says, since compliance boundaries restrict you from discovering SharePoint content, add Megan B to the existing eDiscovery case, who can retrieve the file, and then the case can be closed. Now, I'm not going to touch too much on compliance boundaries because it's outside of the scope of this talk, but compliance boundaries is a way to restrict people from retrieving specific data. So if you only want people to be able to pull exchange emails, you can do that. If you only want people to pull SharePoint files, you can do that. If you want people to only be able to pull from a certain region, right? Maybe you've got investigators in a particular country and there's sort of geo restrictions there. They shouldn't be seeing data outside of their region. You can set up what's called compliance boundaries and really sort of limit them. So in this case, go with the thinking that basically compliance boundaries would prevent me from discovering SharePoint content. And so therefore, I need to add Megan to the case who does have those permissions. And then once the file is retrieved, we'll also close the case in eDiscovery. Okay, so firstly, we need to add Megan to the case, right? So if you remember, again, this is the same familiar sort of 7-step, 3, 6, 9, 10, sorry, 10-step kind of workflow for eDiscovery. To add someone to a case, you need to go to the settings tab. And then within this case information kind of dialog box, you basically hit the select button. And once you hit the select button, it will ask you for users to add, right? So you can see the add button here. So if I hit add, it will let me basically search for people. So we know it's Megan B, which is Megan Bowen in this case. So I can search for Megan. You can see that she pops up there. Again, I've redacted her email, but that would normally be shown there. You can basically then select her and you can add her, which then now updates the users to have 2 users of Purav as well as Megan Bowen, right? Which is what we wanted. Now we come onto the data sources part of the workflow. So the difference here is the SharePoint site is not a custodian location. It's actually what we call a data location or a non-custodial data source. So in this case, we need to choose the second option, which is add data location. All right, so when we do that, you can see that it brings up this wizard of new non-custodial data locations, where you can basically add SharePoint sites, you could add any Exchange sort of public folders or other locations, and you can add M365 connected apps as well as sort of Teams locations. For our purpose, we know that it's a SharePoint site, so we'll hit on Edit SharePoint Sites, which will then bring up this dialog box. Now, what's important to mention here is that the sites that are showing up here will only show up here if they're set to either public or the M365 group associated to those SharePoint sites is set to public. If there's any private SharePoint sites, for example, you may keen audience members may notice that there's 5 items here, 5 items here, but we know that it was uploaded to the Euphoria SharePoint site. So where is the Euphoria SharePoint site? Well, it's probably because that Euphoria SharePoint site is a private one. And how do we find that private SharePoint site? I'll come on to that in a minute. But just keep that at the back of your mind that the sites that show up here will only show up here if they're public. Or the groups associated to them are public. So in this case, we have US sales, we have a test, we have sample, we have sales and marketing, and we have retail as well. Okay, so when we search for Euphoria, because maybe we know that that's the name of the SharePoint site, so surely that should show up, we get no items. We actually need to add the full URL specifically for that SharePoint site, which you can get from the audit log event of the file upload to the SharePoint site that we mentioned earlier. Or you could, maybe even discover that site and copy the URL from the address bar, however you want to get that URL. And then once you find that URL, you can basically then search for that specifically, and you can see that now it resolves to the name and the URL that we want. right? Again, I've redacted the sort of domain name of the SharePoint site, but that typically would be like company1.sharepoint.com, etc. When you do that, it basically then allows you to add a hold to the SharePoint site. Now, we covered holds in the first scenario. And once again, for our purposes, we're not going to deal with holds. So I'm going to untick holds and hit add, which will basically add that non-custodial data location to the case. And now you can see it starting to index here, right? So similar to what we saw before, a non-custodial data source also needs to index. So again, you can either wait for that to index or you can proceed and see if you get any results. But in our case, we'll wait for it to fully index as it says there, and now we can proceed to the collection part. So the collection part, right? So basically you can create a new collection like we saw before, but you can also see the existing collection, which is collection 1 from the previous scenario. For this second collection, once again, you can specify a name and description. I'm going to do collection number 2. Custodial data sources, again, we're not dealing with custodial in this case, we're dealing with non-custodial. So we'll leave this one blank. So now we come onto non-custodial data sources. And if we hit select non-custodial data sources, it will pre-populate with what we selected just now, which is the Euphoria site, right? Again, another reason why you need to make sure that you configure those correctly so that they can show up here. If they don't show up here, you can also add them as additional locations, but it's better to just configure them until you get to this stage, so it makes it easier for you. So once that shows up, you can then select them and hit add, which will then add them as a non-custodial data source to the case and specifically to the collection in this case. You can add additional locations, as I mentioned, but again, we're not going to deal with that here. And now you come to the query part. So with the query part, again, you can use the query builder, and we know we're trying to pull a file, right? So maybe there's properties like file extension or file name. So let's have a look. So if we search for doc, maybe we're trying to find like document author or document metadata or document ID. You can see that there's no results. Okay, well, let's do file. So with file, you can see file type. Okay, interesting. So there's no file name property. Well, there is, but you need to go into the KQL for that. And this is an example of where certain properties will not show up in the query builder, but they will in the KQL editor. So one such property is document link. Document link you can find from the object ID property in the audit event of file upload to SharePoint, which basically is a full path to that specific file, right? So it'll be company.sharepoint.com/site/euphoria/ all the way to big3.xlsx. And again, you can see the file name property, which we know is big3, and we know the extension is xlsx, right? So those 3 properties, apart from file extension, are not able to be done in Query Builder. So you need to do them within the KQL editor. So that's important to remember. Okay, so then you can review the collection. So your search criteria for this is document link, equals that link, file name is that, and the file extension is xlsx. And again, you can review which sources this is going to apply to, which in this case is the Euphoria SharePoint site. Then it creates the collection. Again, you need to wait for it to change status. You can see here this says progressing. After some time, this will change to, in jobs, will change to successful. And then basically you can see the item here. So now you can see one item. Again, if you do view samples here, you can get a preview of the Excel spreadsheet. In this case, there's no like attachments or anything that you need to see. You can basically preview it here. But again, it's quite hard to see it in this view. So once again, you can hit this button, which will then bring it into full screen view, which is this one here. And now you can see kind of an image here, part 1, right? WDTY, nuke, WSTDY, right? What are these? Well, you can actually click on these tabs and see what's in these individual sheets within the workbook. So if we step onto nuke,
pop another bottle if you like that.
Yeah, so here you can see an image of a tweet of a song, and WSTDY, again, you can click on that and see part 2 and another image, right? So this could be anything sensitive that you want to understand and deal with as per your policies. But in this case, there's no need to commit it to a review set because, as I mentioned, there's no attachment or anything. So you can directly export this from the collection. And the way you do that is you hit the actions button, and then there's this option here of export collected items that you can see the 5th one down in the list, or I can do this, and that's the option there. So when you do that, it will bring up a dialog box. And again, you can choose the name of the export. So we'll choose export of collection 2. You can configure some properties. So you can say if you want the items with hits, as well as partially indexed items or partially indexed items without hits. For my case, I only want the ones with hits because, again, those are the ones that we know. In this case, it's just one file, but if it was multiple files, you want the files that relate to your investigation and nothing extra. And you can also add some other options like what we saw earlier about collecting additional conversation history, cloud attachments, etc. But for this purpose, we'll leave it as default and hit export. Once you hit export, it will say your collection is being exported and you can go to exports to track and download. So if we do that, in the jobs tab, you can see that there's a new job created of export collection items, which is in progress. After some time, that will change to successful. And if we now go to the exports, you can see two exports because remember, I did the first one and Megan did the second one. But one thing to notice here is the scope column. So if you look, right, the bottom one says scope is the review set, which makes sense because I committed it to a review set in scenario 1. But the second one, Megan didn't commit it to a review set because there was no need to. She exported it directly from the collection. And so you can see that the scope here is search. And also you can also see that the review set column for Megan's one is blank because there is no review set, right? So that's important to remember that there's two methods to export. You can export from the collection or you can export from the review set. So that's the key takeaway there. So once you open that export, you can see here that you get the zip file, similar to what we showed before. And this is kind of how it looks like in the download view. And once you open that, there's basically this kind of path directory here. What's interesting here is you don't have kind of a native files kind of thing. You have the actual SharePoint path, right? So you can see it's SharePoint, the site name, shared documents, hip hop, etc. Like all the subfolders are here in this kind of directory that you need to go through. So it's kind of preserving that whole path. And then ultimately, when you get into the break the internet folder, it will have big 3 here, right? Which is the Excel spreadsheet that we want. And then finally, if you remember, once we've retrieved the file, we said that the case should be closed. So the way we close the case is we go back to settings, which was the last part of the workflow. I don't have the whole screenshot here, but if you can go with me imaginary, there's a settings kind of tab right on the right-hand side. If you click that, this will bring up these dialog boxes here. And then if you go to case information select, it will bring up this kind of page. Here you can choose actions, and then there's an option here for close case, right? So you can see it here. And what does closing the case actually do? Well, it will warn you here that if you close the case, any holds will be turned off. Again, we didn't really deal with any holds, but if you're dealing with holds, just be mindful that if you do close the case, it will turn off any holds. And a hold, if I didn't cover it before, is basically a way to preserve data, but you may have sort of other policies, retention management, etc., taking care of those. So, judge whether you want to use eDiscovery holds or whether you're happy with your retention management kind of holds. And then finally, the case will be closed and you can see it says successful, right? So similar to before, let's audit those very quickly, just a bit conscious of time. So there's 6 operations again, which is case member updated, non-custodian source created, query created, search exported, export viewed, and case updated. Okay, so case member updated. So again, the same kind of idea with the field. So you always get the creation time, operation, user ID, case ID, but the column on the right is the one that's unique to this operation, which is basically the parameters bracket 0, dot value, which basically gives you the idea of who the members are of the case. Now, what's interesting here is it's got the members as both me and Megan. So it doesn't know that Megan was the new one added. It just knows that, after this operation completed, the status of the membership is 2 members. So for example, if you had 3 members and you added 1, you can't rely on this audit event to tell you which was that 4th member. You would almost need to know who the 3 members were previously and then basically do a delta. So maybe Microsoft can work on that if they're listening. But yeah, that's just something to remember, that it will show you the kind of full membership of the case rather than who explicitly was added. But it does also mention who was added, but you kind of need to know that Purav was there before. Otherwise, you wouldn't realize that Megan was the new person. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, non-custodian source created. Right, so here again, you can see that all it gives you is the non-custodian source ID. If you remember before, for the custodian ones, you had the custodian name, you had the custodian email address. Well, for non-custodian sources, you only get this kind of GUID ID, which really means nothing to no one. So you actually kind of have to decipher this, right? And those familiar with my Deciphering UAL series, I found a method to decipher various kind of GUIDs and IDs in the audit log, and this is one such example. But with this one, you actually have to use Graph API PowerShell, right? So I'm a bit new to Graph API PowerShell, but I've managed to get this going. What you need to do is basically create what's called an app registration. Again, I'm not going to go too much into Graph API in this talk, but once you create that app registration, you'll have an app ID. You'll obviously know your tenant ID. You can specify that non-custodian ID that we saw previously. You can specify the case ID. You then connect to Graph, and then you basically run this commandlet, which is get mg security case, eDiscovery case, non-custodial data source, and you specify these properties about the case ID, the non-custodial source ID, and then you kind of do some enumeration of the fields, and eventually you'll come to this, which says that the web URL is, company.sharepoint.com/site/euphoria, which is what we expected, right? So this is one way that you can prove that the site that Megan added was the site in scope, right? So it's important to be able to understand how you decipher that value, and hopefully that was helpful. For anyone a bit new to Graph, I do want to give a shout out to Daniel Bradley, who wrote this great book on Graph PowerShell for administrators. It's definitely come in handy and has allowed me to understand how to use Graph API for a few use cases. So just a call out there. Okay, then we move on to the query created operation. So the query created, similar to last time, will give you the name of the query, or the search rather, which is collection 2. Here you also have a query ID property, which is 43C8. And you also get the query text, which is basically the keyword query language conditions of that search. And again, you can get the non-custodian source IDs. So as we saw before, 4639, which was the NCDS ID, non-custodial data source ID, you can prove basically that that search was run against them. Again, this is helpful because if you have multiple data locations, you want to make sure that the query is run against the right one. And this is one way to ensure that that's in place. Okay, then you have the search exported. So if you remember, we exported it from the collection. So here you have the query ID, which is 43C8. And if you go back, you can remember that query ID matches what was that search done, right? So that then proves that that search resulted in results, which was then exported. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. And then export viewed, again, similar to before, you can see that, that search to export that was done, that export was viewed and therefore most likely downloaded. But one thing to call out is these last two columns here. AED object type is 0 because this is not an advanced eDiscovery capability. To export from collections to to basically do collection to export, it's an eDiscovery kind of standard feature. Whereas committing to a review set, etc., is a premium feature. So advanced eDiscovery is only for premium. So if you remember this use case, we didn't need to commit it to a review set, and therefore we haven't used any advanced eDiscovery properties, which is why this is a 0. And what that also then means is that extended properties is blank, whereas previously this extended properties would show the review set ID to prove that the export was done from the review set. So in this case, it's kind of a bit weird because it doesn't really tell you that this export correlates to anything we saw before. Like, it will be helpful maybe if that export operation contained the query ID, because then at least you'd know that that query ID generated a export and then that export was actually viewed. So maybe something for Microsoft to add if they're watching. But yeah, currently the audit event for export viewed for the second scenario is very limited. And you wouldn't really exactly know which export was viewed just because there's no additional field to correlate that against. And then finally, you have the case updated. So case updated will show you nothing but the case being closed. Keen eyes in the audience may have noticed previously there was also a delete case operation. There's also a reopen operation. So all of those would be logged within the parameter 0.value. So instead of close true, it could be like dash reopen true or dash delete true, etc., etc. But most of those, if not all, would come under the case updated operation. And again, you can see that Megan did that. You can see which case she did it against and when she did it and what the operation was as well. Okay, cool. So just to wrap up, this is basically what we've covered today. So given you kind of a high-level cheat sheet sort of thing of Purview eDiscovery and Purview Audit, again, it's important to remember that eDiscovery can be used to retrieve content from M365. And Purview Audit can basically be used to investigate activities that have occurred in your M365 sort of tenant. We walked through one scenario in Exchange Online, which was to retrieve an email with a sensitive attachment that left the organization. We then audited that scenario to make sure that the eDiscovery that was done was correct and matching expected sort of configuration and standards. We then walked through a second eDiscovery scenario around SharePoint, where the objective was to retrieve a suspicious file that was added to a SharePoint site that was previously known to have suspicious activity. And then we audited that scenario, which also involves sort of deciphering one field, which is the non-custodian source ID field, using Graph API PowerShell. So with that, I would like to say thank you for listening to my talk. Hopefully you found it insightful and valuable. And if there are any questions, I think there's some questions in the chat. So let me see. Okay, so Jatin asked, does eDiscovery work in case the email is deleted by the user after sending externally? That's a really good question. So when a user deletes the email, it would go to deleted items. And if they purge it from deleted items, it would go into sort of a recoverable items folder and then, maybe eventually be completely purged. So if it's in a deleted items, yes, you can recover it. If it's in sort of the quarantine, I think eDiscovery can also recover it. It's not a use case I've tested, but I believe it can. But if it's completely purged,